All right, let's go ahead and get started. Again, as I just mentioned, thank you for joining our webinar. Some housekeeping notes before we get the ball rolling. The attendees are muted. If you have any questions, please ask in the questions box. You can see where that is in the picture on the right, and we'll get those questions answered at the end of the webinar. The webinar should run for about 25 minutes or so, and then we'll have about 5 to 10 minutes for questions. And the webinar does include a demo at the end, so definitely stay around for that. And we are recording this presentation and will be sent to you tomorrow. Without further ado, let's have some introductions. I am Joe Marshall, the Customer and Partner Marketing Manager here at Prodly, and Abby Malvestuto is our Customer Success Manager at Prodly, and she is going to be presenting most of the information today on bidirectional sandbox seeding. The format is going to be in question and answer. We got some questions from some registrants for this webinar, so we're going to answer some questions that they had, and we can go ahead to that first question. It is on the topic of sandbox seeding. Why do I need to move data from production to a sandbox?
Awesome. So actually, there's quite a few pretty neat reasons why you would want to do something like this. The answers for today's webinar have been pulled from past experiences with Salesforce customers and our customers as well. So without further ado on that, you're going to want to set up devs and admins with uniform data to start and test projects. This is super important to make sure that your entire team is on the same page and using the same data. Also, you can expand the value of your dev orgs by eliminating dependencies on full copy use. What we've seen are Salesforce customers that often have one, maybe two full copies, a couple partial copies in there, but they have dozens of unused dev orgs. So by seeding your sandboxes, you're able to basically treat them the same way as you would if you were using a full copy or a partial copy with that same data that's coming directly from prod. So along that note, you want to eliminate making changes in prod. Obviously, that is a big governance no-no. If you are making changes in prod and something goes wrong, you're in prod, and so it could mess with other people's day-to-day. So quickly setting up dev orgs and scratch orgs for hot fixes and anytime you're testing changes on any of the data is absolutely the way to go, and that's best practice. So you also have the ability to use your dev orgs for training. So you can set up individual dev orgs with training data. So you can either put data in there from prod for your new hires to work with. You can create training data, so trainees aren't using real data, and then you can basically deploy that entire subset of data into your dev orgs. So again, you're using real data, but without the real consequences of doing that. Also, you can update a full copy sandbox with prod data ahead of a refresh date. So in this example, that would be, we know that full and partial copies can only be refreshed so often. So if you need to refresh any of those environments, you can do that ahead of that, again, that refresh date by doing it this way.
Great, next question. Can Prodly help me deploy data from production to a sandbox?
And the answer to that being absolutely. So here we have a screenshot of what Prodly does in order to accomplish this. This is one of the many data sets that we have available to our customers. You can see all of the objects that are associated with this data set, and each one of those arrows is a lookup pointing in the direction of the lookup for this data set. We'll get into this in a second. I'll show you what this looks like in real time, kind of at the end with the demo, so you can make a little bit more sense of this. But also here, we have some examples of what those data sets look like, and as well as the deployment plans and folders and so on and so forth. That will make a lot more sense during the demo. But suffice it to say that yes, you can deploy entire complex relational data schemes at once. So that was the data set. Data sets are able to be set it and forget it. So once you have everything set up and you've tested it and you've deployed with it and everything is good, once you save it, you can just keep reusing it. You can pre-configure data sets for specific use cases. So that entire list of data sets that you saw, we have data sets in there for everything from FS data, advanced approvals, financial force, Conga. We have data sets in there specifically for Sandbox seeding. And then the ability to create data sets from scratch, depending on what your organization's use case is as well. The cool thing there also is that Prodly will determine the correct order of operations during a deployment. So you don't have to worry about knowing which order to deploy certain objects in to make sure that everything gets moved over correctly and that all the relationships are maintained. We do that for you. Also with that, the ability to download templates from us, download data sets, clone them, and then customize them. And then also, like I said, create them from scratch. So that's pretty cool. All of those can be stored in folders or deployment plans. And again, once they're there, it's just done and done. Also, the ability to migrate data up to 5 orgs simultaneously. So if you do have an entire team that's working on a project and you want to have each one of those devs their own sandbox, all with the same data, as we mentioned before, you can immediately migrate data up to 5 of those dev orgs at the same time. Also, the ability to disable and re-enable org platform events automatically during a deployment. We call this event control. And so when you go to do a deployment, you can say, hey, I know that these objects in these fields actually have events on them that I know might mess with my deployment results and give me errors, because I've tried to do this before using other methods. Yeah, you can tell Prodly to disable them. And then after the deployment is complete, Prodly will re-enable them automatically. Also, we have ways to keep individual fields secure with options for obfuscating, appending that the data in that field, and or you can just use whatever is in the default for that. And as I mentioned before, you can create and share reusable deployment plans. So you can either use the deployment plans that we have available to you. You can download those. I'll show you what that looks like if you want to download a template and install it. Or if you've created one yourself, you're able to store that as a JSON file. So that's pretty neat.
Next question, and before we get to this question, I see we've had few more people join in the last couple of minutes. We are just going through some questions that you had submitted around Sandbox seeding, bidirectional Sandbox seeding. Feel free as well to submit some questions in the box, and we'll get to those at the end. But going on to our next question, can Sandbox seeding be bidirectional? Again, the topic of our webinar is bidirectional Sandbox seeding. Can Sandbox seeding be bidirectional?
Well, the answer to that being kind of. So when you're talking about seeding implies that you're going from production to a sandbox, right? You're like planting a seed. So you are seeding the sandbox. Data is deployed to production. Data, I mean, when you say deployment is the same if you're moving data from A to B, regardless of what A to B looks like. But when you're saying seeding, that is more specifically going from prod to sandbox. Regardless though, Prodly can manage both parts of this process by allowing you to reuse the same data sets to push data to and from production. A common misconception there being that we can only go one way with it. Nope, not so much. We can actually go from A to B, and again, as long as you have a connection to an org, that org can be used for a source or a destination. So yeah, you can use data from production to a sandbox, make fixes outside of prod, redeploy the data to production after it's been tested and it's safe. That is the correct change management process. That is Salesforce's best practice, and that is also where we align ourselves here at Prodly. So also being able to effectively push data, as I said, up, down, and sideways. So that's what that looks like. And that helps increase the organization health and help fight errors and increase efficiently. Again, that's just its best practice and its governance. Also along those lines, audit is a nice word that we like to use here, because when you do things this way, especially if you're doing it with Prodly, but you have access to audit history, you want to make this part of your governance process in general, because you're eliminating the ability to make erroneous data pushes into prod and make sure that production is not going to be affected and your day-to-day is not going to be affected. Again, that's standard practice. And yeah, so this will eliminate things like no more CSVs on desktops, having to download them, and depending on how many devs you've got, they're all going to be part of that process, all downloading CSVs, manipulating the CSVs, and then re-pushing things. So there's just too many places where things can go wrong. Also, as I said, audit tracking with deployment results, being able to go back in and say who did a deployment, when did that deployment occur, and what data was moved. And then if you're seeding from a VC repository, being able to track what is being checked in and checked out by whom. So that's also pretty important when governance is being talked about. So here we want to kind of highlight what this process would look like in real time. So ideally, you would start with seeding your sandbox, a fresh sandbox with data from production. So that's going to be here. Here we go, here, and then down to here when we are seeding our sandbox here. After the sandbox has been seeded, you want to come back and start making your changes in those sandbox. Whether you're adding in new products, whether you're changing calculations, so on and so forth, making sure all of that is correct. And then once everything has the nice warm and fuzzies, we're going to push that into your staging environment. This is usually where those full copy sandboxes are going to shine, because they are an exact replica of production. So making sure everything looks good here. And then once again, we've got round 2 of warm and fuzzies. Then you can push that back up into prod. So now the fun part. I get to show you what this looks like in real time. So this is it. So this is what it looks like with Prodly. We've got several tabs here at the top. Everything is pretty accessible. Everything is going to be point and click, which is super quick and super easy. Instead of having to go through and download the CSVs, manipulate your CSVs, everything is just here. So you start the process with your connections. We want to make sure that we have all of our connections set. First connection being to our control org. This is where everything is being controlled from. Not going to have to worry about installing Prodly into every single org. It's just installed once. I've already created connection to a source and a destination that we can play around with today. Any connection, as I said before, that I have login access to can be used as a source or a destination. So once we have those established, we can come here and say, okay, cool. Let me go ahead and make those folders that I was talking about before. You can set up folders for everything from individual use cases and projects. We have ones here for different apps, and we've got sandbox seeding, org merges. We have ones for training only. And then we have individual devs and admins can have their own folders. And again, you can store connections in here. You can store data sets and deployment plans. All of that is going to live comfortably within here. So yeah, so after you have all of this set up, then you can come in and say, okay, let's take a look at the actual data sets. These are the nuts and bolts, the bread and butter of what makes Prodly Prodly. So this is your entire list of data sets, which depending on your org can get pretty overwhelming. This is the exact reason why we will store a lot of these within folders, so you can just come into the folder and find them. But this is what they look like. We can kind of go into any of these data sets, actually. Let's see if I can find the one that I put in here for seeding. I'm just going to do a quick search. There it is. Cool. Then we wait for Salesforce to load. Hey, okay, cool. So just like I was mentioning earlier, you can go through and choose any object that you have within your org and available to you as your root object. From here, you can include any queries that you would like. The great thing about these things, all of these data sets and all of these templates are available here. So you have a few options. You can just download them, and then you would import them into this admin tab here. And then after you've imported them all, you can do a couple of things. You can leave them as is. You can go in here and clone this, and then you can tweak it. Let's say you have use of this data set, but you'd like to have queries depending on if you are seeding to Sandbox A, or if you only want to include a certain subsection of record IDs, you can put that in here after you've cloned it and said, hey, I'm just going to rename this and say this is just Sally's little data set. All of the object fields are selected by default for this object. I don't really want to mess with any of these, but if I wanted to, I did say before that we could obfuscate some of this. So I'm going to come in here and say, you know, this is real client data. This is a billing street. I don't really want people to be seeing that. I'm just going to set a random value here. This is going to anonymize this. So they're still going to get an actual billing street, but it's not going to be the legitimate billing street. This is also pretty useful when we're looking at email fields. Instead of adding dot and valid, you can just scramble it, anonymize it, and you're good to go. Let's say I did clone this data set and I wanted to tweak it. My organization has custom objects that I want to make sure I'm including. Sure. So you can see which one of these are included by default. Maybe I don't want this one. Okay, check mark is gone. Then I would just hit save and I'm good to go. But that seems pretty important, so we're just gonna add that back in. Same thing with child relationships. Hey, look at all these. So if at any point I wanted to include any of these, because I can, we're just gonna click on that, bingo. And now it's added. Man, but I wish there was a way I could see what exactly is going on in this data set. I wonder how I would do that. We're gonna come over here. This is diagram view. This will show us everything in this data set. Each one of these objects is now a hyperlink. I can double click into any of these objects and add further SOQL queries if I wanted to. I can tweak any of the objects available, or fields, sorry, in any of these objects in here. I can hover over any of these lookups and see the field that is being referenced in these lookups. Here it's opportunity ID, for example, LinkedIn entity ID, so on and so forth. And then, yeah. So this is what it would look like if you actually wanted to go through and customize a data set. Can be a little bit overwhelming. Again, if you are a current customer with Prodly, you can contact your CSM and we will actually help you go through and tweak these according to your needs. Or you can just create one from scratch and we will work on that for you as well. But again, the great thing about it being that once you have everything set the way you want it, you're just going to hit save and you are good to go. The next thing there being deployment plans. So you can string a bunch of these data sets together into a deployment plan. That way you only have to hit deploy once instead of hitting it 16 times, depending on the number of data sets that you have. These deployment plans that we have in here are default deployment plans, which are part of these templates that you can see here. So once you've downloaded these templates, they show up in your deployment plan. Hey, tabs. Deployment plan list. Cool. You can click into any one of these and actually see all the steps involved in that. So CPQ is pretty big. Lots of steps involved in CPQ, lots of data sets involved with CPQ. That's what these deployment plan items are here. So let's say that I know that my org has custom objects that I wanted to include as part of this deployment plan. That way, once I hit deploy on this, it'll move my entire CPQ implementation, but also my custom objects. Or if I wanted to include the Sandbox seeding data set as part of my CPQ deployment, yeah, sure, you can do that. You can also add that to advanced approvals. You can add that to Financial Force. so on and so forth. It doesn't matter. If it's an object in Salesforce, it'll move. And then you would just add that here to your deployment plan items. So, ta-da! These are all the data sets that are in here. Pretty neat, pretty easy. So let's say from here, I'm going to go, well, I've gone in, I've tweaked my data set, and we can come in here. Let's take a look at this data set. This is one of the ones that I like to demo with a little bit because it is smaller and easier to manage. Okay, so I've got the warm and fuzzies. I've already gone in here. This data set looks great. All of these lookups are perfect. I've tested this data set and it's good to go. Maybe I'm not really sure if I'm able to do a deployment into that sandbox just yet. I don't really have the green light. I'm not really sure where we're at in that process, but I still want to see how this data set actually is going to behave. I can do that with simulate. So we're going to hit simulate on this. I'm going to choose my source. Hey there. And I know that this is the correct data set that we're going to mess around with. So let's simulate what this would look like. You can simulate what your deployment is going to do. There's some caveats in there because you're basically querying the source, but this will actually tell you, hey, if the data set is set up correctly, it should still show you which records are being brought up that meet your query filters and your criteria. It'll tell you, hey, if there's no records that meet your criteria, it'll tell you here. If there's an issue with your connection, this won't even start. So this is a really good place to mess around with your data sets just to make sure everything looks good. After this simulate is complete, it'll say, hey, everything's done, everything's good. Theoretically, if you were going to do a real deployment, these are how many records would come over. So let's say that part of your query, I only expected 2 records to come over, but you're seeing all this. Then you can go back in and either tweak the data set or you can contact your CSM and say, hey, I'm not really sure what's happening here, and we'll work through that with you. That's all included as part of your subscription. So on top of that, let's actually go here. So if you actually went through and did a real deployment, this is what it would look like. These are the records that did come through. We did updates on all of these. They could be updates or they could be inserts. If it's brand new, net new data, it'll say insert here. And then it says, this is the upsert method that we chose and whether or not we had any record failures trying to bring those records over. In this case, we did. Those failures are going to be the same thing that you would see using something like data loader that says it could be permissions based, it could be a validation rule. So from here, I would just click on view results. I would take a look at what that error says and then troubleshoot that error, fix my data set, and then redeploy. So this process could take minutes up to a few hours, depending on the size of the data set. But again, something that's just set it, forget it, and you're good to go. And on that note, when it comes to set it and forget it, the only other way to get honestly more advanced with this is going to be using our integration guide that will allow you to automatically seed a sandbox whenever you refresh it. So that's pretty much the gist of that. Joe, were there any other questions that came in while I was doing this, anything that anybody wanted to see?
Yeah, we just had one question, and anyone feel free to ask any more and we'll try to get those answered. But just the one is, what does this process look like without Prodly?
Oh, goodness. So I've done it. I've done it once, and that's because I refuse to do it again. So without Prodly, generally what you would have to do is use something like a data loader, basically. So you would go to data loader and say, okay, these are the objects that are object that I'm interested in. This is how I wanted to move it. And it's going to make you download a series of CSVs. You have to manually go through and map out what your destination objects look like, what they're supposed to be. So there's a lot of manual clicking and process involved, especially if you have to go through and download the CSVs, manipulate the CSVs on your desktop, re-upload the CSVs, rinse and repeat depending on how many objects you're moving. Um, so a process like that could take anywhere from days to weeks, depending on, again, the size of the deployment, excuse me, the size of the deployment that you're trying to actually do, or the size of the project that you're trying to do. And this is usually the reason why there's a lot of Salesforce customers that would, rely on third parties to just set up sandboxes because they have such strict guidelines that they don't have the time to do those things. So at the very least, by doing it this way with Prodly, you have more complete and creative control in what you are moving and how you are moving it, but also obviously doing it in a fraction of the time with a very well, no headache as compared to a very big headache.
Perfect. Well, that was the only question we got. So if you want to go back to the webinar deck, we can wrap up here.
Sure. Let's go back to present. Think.
And we do have some customers as well as non-customers on the call. So if you see this and you're interested and want to learn more about how Prodly can help you do this, and you are a customer, you can reach out to your CSM, whether that's Abby or another one of our CSMs. And if you are not a customer, you can go to the link above, prodly.co/get-demo, and we'll be able to show you how Prodly can do this, as well as other use cases Prodly can help with. That is all we have for today. Thank you very much for joining, and thank you, Abby, for sharing.
Sure.
Again, we're sending out this webinar recording tomorrow, so look out for your inbox for that. And thank you until we talk again. Have a great day.
All right. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye.